The next section, I've got a few slides on what I call the what. So the what of adding advisory services and specifically in this case, cash flow advisory services. First of all, this requires a mindset shift. So if you're kind of a hardcore bookkeeping practitioner, and I remember the first time I took accounting 101 is what it was called in high school. And we had back then, this was a few decades ago now, we had the green ledger sheets. And so I was filling out green ledger sheets by hand and everything, balanced to the penny. And for my math brain, it was very satisfying. I loved accounting 101 in high school, and I loved filling out those ledger sheets. I know that sounds so boring when I talk about it now, but the mindset to do accounting and payroll is different than the mindset required to do advisory services because you go from everything has a place, every transaction needs to go to a specific account. Payroll has to balance to the penny. You don't mess around with people's payroll. You make sure it's accurate all the time. Two, with advisory services, we're talking about intuition, analysis. What does your gut tell you? Looking at historical data and then converting that to based on what's happened recently, what's going to happen in the future. We're talking about being directionally correct instead of down to the penny accurate. In bookkeeping and accounting, we're always looking backwards. We're using historical data, we're closing a month and calling it final, we're closing a year and calling it final. But with advisory services, we're looking forward and it never ends. There is no final. It's, every week is a new, there's a new forecast to do. So, and in bookkeeping and accounting, we do problem solving, of course. In advisory, I call it puzzle solving. So it's problem solving, but the puzzles are a lot bigger. The pieces don't ever seem to fit 100%. And so you do the best you can and get as close to good as you can get it. So that's the mindset shift. And if we run small firms, which I do, a lot of times I'm bouncing back and forth between the two. So sometimes, it's just getting used to the process of going, I know what I'm doing on the left, and now I got to shift to the right. So here's some tools that help with cash flow advisory. They're dependent on cash flow analysis or cash flow analysis. Sometimes they're dependent on these tools. I think these are the key tools. They're the ones that I teach in the program that I offer. So for example, deciding or learning about, the fixed and variable costs within a business, identifying which is which and knowing, which ones are more fixed, which ones vary with revenue and volume, building cash flow dashboards, selecting the key cash indicators or the key performance indicators that are kind of focused on cash, depending on your client and what they want, what they need. Using contribution profit and contribution profit margin, which is a little different than gross profit and gross profit margin. A lot of times I'm helping clients with marginal sales analysis, which just shows them, if you grow and depending on your ideal client, your ideal customer, what does that growth look like? That's what marginal sales analysis does. Break-even point analysis for those companies that haven't broken even and need help getting there. Rolling cash flow forecasts. Anyway, so these are some of the tools. And then, of course, now it's all, how can I get help from AI to do this faster and better? And there's a lot of new tools coming out all the time to help with that. So there's a lot of cash flow or advisory services frameworks out there. This is my method. And again, right now, I focus only on cash flow. That may change in the future, but this is the cash flow advisory framework that I've come up with. Max may use something different. Other coaches or teachers that you work with may do something differently, but I found that this works pretty well. And in the first two steps, it's kind of looking at data that's already available, from QuickBooks or whatever the accounting system is, to assess where a business is at, assess their cash, how they're managing cash, analyzing that some key cash indicators that I mentioned earlier to prepare a cash flow dashboard. And then steps 3 and 4 are more, transition to more forward looking, which is helping them with a forecast. And there's a couple of different ways to do that. One is to look out long term, do a monthly cash flow forecast that goes into the future 18, 36 months, however long that they want to look ahead. And there's also a weekly cash flow forecast. And I decide, make those decisions based on what the client's needs are. So the more concerned they are with cash flow, the more often, we update their forecasts. Kingdom Story for Company, for example, that I mentioned at the beginning, that was weekly at a minimum, sometimes more than weekly, because they were in, a problem situation. And then number four is then providing the advice and the guidance that a client needs. And so this process that I teach helps bookkeeping firm owners go from I'm not offering any advisory services right now to how do you get your first 1 to 2 clients, either to upgrade or new clients to sign on. And then the same framework becomes a repeatable system, for any client that you onboard that says, yeah, I need help with cash flow. It's the same process. So.